Jason sat at a corner booth in Mel's diner, his stomach tightening with hunger. The rich scent of grilled steak, buttered corn, and fresh biscuits filled the air, making his mouth water. A waitress passed by, balancing a tray with a plate of crispy fried chicken and a heap of mashed potatoes drowning in thick gravy. His fingers twitched. He could almost taste it. But Jason knew better. Reaching into his pocket, he felt the small stack of crumpled bills, the result of months of saving. Lawn mowing in the summer heat, shoveling snow in the biting cold, skipping school lunches to pocket the few extra dollars. It wasn't much, but it was meant for his mom. Her birthday was coming up, and he had promised himself he would get her something nice. Something she deserved. He glanced at the laminated menu in front of him, the words blurring together as he stared. A burger and fries would cost less than $10. He could afford it. But then what? With a quiet sigh, he closed the menu. One more hour. Maybe two. He could wait. Hunger was nothing compared to the look on his mom's face when he'd finally hand her a real gift. Jason was lost in his thoughts, staring at the menu but not really seeing the words. The low hum of conversation, the clatter of silverware, and the occasional burst of laughter from nearby tables filled the diner. It was just another evening, until it wasn't. A sharp voice sliced through the air. "If you can't pay, you don't eat here." Jason's head snapped up. At the far end of the diner, near the cash register, an elderly couple stood frozen. The man, his silver hair neatly combed, patted down his pockets with trembling hands. The woman, wrapped in a faded wool coat, clutched at his arm, her eyes filled with quiet desperation. Behind the counter, the manager, a broad-shouldered man with a permanent scowl, stood with his arms crossed. His voice dripped with impatience. "Let me guess. You had money when you got here, but now it's just gone, right?" He scoffed. "I've heard it all before." The woman's voice wavered. "Please, sir, we must have dropped it. Just give us a moment to look." The manager let out a humorless laugh. "Sure. And while we're at it, maybe everyone here should chip in for your meal, huh?" He turned, sweeping his gaze across the diner as if daring someone to speak up. No one did. A businessman in a pressed suit shook his head and muttered something under his breath. A woman dabbed at her mouth with a napkin, avoiding eye contact. Jason's grip tightened on the edge of the table. He could feel his pulse pounding. He didn't know this couple. He had no idea if they were telling the truth. But he knew one thing for certain. No one deserved to be treated like this. The diner fell into an uneasy silence. Conversations quieted, forks paused midair, but no one spoke. The manager, Mr. Thompson, stood tall behind the counter, his gaze locked on the elderly couple. His expression twisted into a sneer. "You people always have a story," he muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. "First, it's, 'I lost my wallet.' Next, it's, 'Oh, please, let me work it off like in some heartwarming movie.'" He chuckled, but there was no kindness in it. The old man swallowed hard, his hands still patting his coat, searching pockets he had already checked a dozen times. His wife clung to his arm, her face flushed with embarrassment. Jason could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on the room. Eyes darted away, avoiding the unfolding scene. A man in a crisp suit shook his head and sipped his coffee. A woman, lipstick smudged on her napkin, glanced toward the door as if looking for an escape. No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted trouble. And that was exactly what Mr. Thompson counted on. His voice dropped, just loud enough for those nearest to hear. "Maybe you thought if you sat down and ordered like everyone else, no one would notice you didn't belong. Jason's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about money. Jason's chair scraped against the tiled floor as he stood, the sharp sound cutting through the heavy silence. All eyes turned to him, but he didn't care. His heart pounded, but his voice was steady. "That's enough." The manager, Mr. Thompson, raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Oh, great. Now we've got a little hero." Jason ignored him. He turned to the elderly couple. The woman's hands trembled as she clutched her scarf, her husband's shoulders slumped in quiet defeat. Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled wad of bills, the money he had spent months saving for his mother's birthday. The money he had earned mowing lawns, raking leaves, skipping snacks at school. He stepped forward and slapped it onto the counter. "There," he said, his voice firm. "Now you don't have an excuse." For the first time, Mr. Thompson hesitated. Then, with a dramatic sigh, he swiped the money from the counter and stuffed it into the register. "Fine," he muttered. "But don't come crying when they play you for a fool." Jason didn't even acknowledge him. He turned back to the couple, offering a small, tired smile. "Everyone needs help sometimes." Jason sat back down, his hands tightening into fists on the table. The weight of what he had just done settled deep in his chest. His mother's birthday money, gone. The diner hummed back to life as if nothing had happened. People returned to their meals, their conversations, their lives. 15 minutes passed. Jason barely moved, his appetite replaced by a hollow feeling in his stomach. He reached for his phone, shifting in his seat, when something slipped from the table, a napkin fluttering to the floor. Sighing, he bent down to pick it up. That's when he saw it. Tucked beneath the booth across from him, hidden in the shadows, was a black leather wallet. It was slightly worn at the edges, its smooth surface catching the dim light. Jason hesitated, then reached for it, fingers brushing against the cool leather. Jason turned the wallet over in his hands, his pulse quickening. He hadn't expected this, not after everything that had just happened. With a deep breath, he flipped it open, his fingers careful as he examined the contents. Inside, there were a few neatly folded dollar bills, a couple of worn business cards, and a small bundle of receipts. But what caught his eye was the photo tucked behind a clear plastic sleeve. It was old, slightly faded, but unmistakable. A younger version of the elderly couple, Evelyn and Henry, stood in front of a cozy white house, their smiles warm and full of life. The kind of picture people carry not because they have to, but because it means something. Jason swallowed hard. This was theirs. He rifled through the wallet quickly now, searching for anything else that might confirm what he already knew. A driver's license. A few membership cards. All of them had the same name, Henry Whitmore. They hadn't been lying. They hadn't been trying to cheat the diner. They had really lost their wallet. A lump formed in Jason's throat as he looked toward the diner's entrance. But Evelyn and Henry were gone. And now, he had to find them. Jason shot up from his seat, gripping the wallet tightly. His eyes darted around the diner, scanning every table, every booth near the entrance. But Evelyn and Henry were nowhere to be seen. He pushed through the crowd, stepping outside into the cool evening air. The street was busy, headlights flashing as cars passed, people walking in either direction. He turned left, then right, searching for familiar faces. Nothing. His stomach twisted. They were gone. Jason clenched his jaw. He had to do something. They had already been humiliated once tonight, he couldn't let them go home thinking the world had completely turned its back on them. Then an idea struck him. The police station. It was just a few blocks away, and if there was any chance of getting the wallet back to them, that was the best option. Without a second thought, he took off, his sneakers pounding against the pavement as he weaved through the crowd. By the time he reached the station, he was out of breath, his fingers cold from gripping the wallet so tightly. He stepped inside, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. A uniformed officer behind the desk looked up, eyeing him with mild suspicion. "Something you need, kid?" Jason hesitated, then set the wallet down on the counter. "I found this. It belongs to an elderly couple, Evelyn and Henry Whitmore. They lost it at the diner down the street, but I couldn't find them." The officer exhaled, glancing at the wallet before flipping it open. "We'll try to contact them," he said, jotting something down. "You got a name or number in case they want to reach you?" Jason swallowed, nodding as he recited his number. It wasn't much. But at least now, there was a chance they'd get it back. The morning light filtered weakly through the thin curtains of the small apartment. Jason sat at the worn kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring a bowl of oatmeal that was thinner than usual, stretched with extra water to make it last. Across from him, his mother sipped black coffee, her tired eyes distant, lost in thought. Neither of them spoke much. The weight of the previous night still hung in the air. Jason had done the right thing, he knew that. But knowing didn't make the emptiness in his chest any lighter. Then, the knock came. Sharp. Firm. Unexpected. Jason's head snapped up. His mother frowned, setting her coffee down as she slowly pushed her chair back. It was too early for visitors. A cold sliver of unease slid down Jason's spine as she hesitated near the door. "Who is it?" she called. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, a warm, familiar voice filtered through the wood. "Jason, dear, it's Evelyn and Henry." Jason shot to his feet. His mother glanced back at him, confusion creasing her brow. He moved before she could say anything, reaching for the lock. As the door swung open, the elderly couple stood framed in the dim glow of the apartment hallway, their faces illuminated by the flickering overhead light. Evelyn smiled the moment she saw him. "Oh, sweetheart," she said softly. "I had a feeling we'd find you here." Jason stood frozen in the doorway, his heart pounding. Evelyn and Henry, standing right there. He hadn't expected to see them again, not like this. His mother, still seated at the kitchen table, furrowed her brow, glancing between Jason and the elderly couple. "I'm sorry, but, how did you find us?" Henry smiled, his kind eyes crinkling at the edges. "The police called us early this morning," he explained, stepping forward slightly. "They told us a young man had turned in our wallet. We knew immediately it had to be you." Evelyn nodded, her expression full of warmth. "As soon as we heard, we asked if they could help us find you. They were hesitant at first, but once we explained everything, they agreed to pass along your contact information." Jason swallowed hard, shifting on his feet. I just wanted to make sure you got it back," he murmured. Henry chuckled. "We know, son. That's exactly why we're here." Evelyn's gaze softened as she glanced around the small apartment, taking in the fraying couch, the chipped kitchen table, the stack of unopened bills resting on the counter. She exchanged a quick look with Henry before turning back to Jason's mother. "We didn't just come to say thank you," she said gently. "We wanted to see you. To truly understand the kind of young man who would give away the only money he had to help strangers." Jason's mother exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around her coffee mug. "He's a good boy," she said quietly. Henry smiled, his voice steady. "That much, we already knew." Jason felt his throat tighten. He hadn't done any of it for recognition, but standing there, looking at them, he realized, maybe kindness had a way of coming back after all. Isabella stood near the doorway, her fingers still curled around the doorknob as she took in the sight of the elderly couple standing before her. Her eyes flickered with confusion, uncertainty, and just the slightest hint of caution. She had spent years learning to expect the worst, to brace for disappointments, to push through struggles without waiting for help. So when two well-dressed strangers showed up at her door, asking for her son, she wasn't sure what to think. Jason, still standing beside her, shifted on his feet. "Mom, this is Evelyn and Henry," he said hesitantly. Isabella nodded slowly. "I figured," she murmured, looking them over. "But why are you here?" Evelyn stepped forward, her warm smile softening the tension in the air. "We wanted to meet you," she said simply. "And to thank your son properly." Isabella's gaze darted to Jason. "For what?" Henry cleared his throat. "For what he did last night. For stepping up when no one else did." His voice carried a quiet weight, a sincerity that made Isabella's chest tighten. She exhaled, glancing at Jason, her expression unreadable. What exactly did he do? Jason avoided her eyes, suddenly feeling small. He hadn't planned to tell her everything, not like this. But now, with Evelyn and Henry standing in their tiny apartment, there was no avoiding it. Henry smiled knowingly. "He gave us everything he had," he said. "For two strangers he didn't know." Isabella blinked, her breath catching. She turned fully to Jason now, eyes searching his face. "Jason, your birthday money?" Jason swallowed hard. "They needed it more than we did." Silence filled the room. For a long moment, Isabella didn't speak. Then, slowly, she let out a breath and turned back to Evelyn and Henry. I don't know what to say." Evelyn smiled gently. "Then let us do the talking." Isabella sat down slowly at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug as she studied the elderly couple standing in front of her. Jason, still standing near the door, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Evelyn glanced at Henry before turning back to them, her warm smile tinged with something knowing. "Jason, dear," she said softly, "we aren't just an old couple who lost their wallet last night." Jason frowned, glancing at his mother, who looked just as confused as he felt. "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously. Henry chuckled, stepping forward. "We don't usually share this with people right away," he admitted, "but I think you both deserve to know the truth." He reached into the pocket of his coat, pulling out a sleek leather card holder. With practiced ease, he retrieved a simple, elegant business card and slid it onto the table. Jason's mother hesitated before picking it up. Her eyes scanned the text, and her breath hitched slightly. Jason leaned over, reading the bold letters at the top. "Whitmore Investments." His eyes widened. Henry watched their reactions with quiet patience. "My wife and I are, well, let's just say we've been very fortunate in life," he explained. "We built our business from the ground up, and over the years, it has done quite well." Jason's throat felt dry. "You mean, you're rich?" Evelyn chuckled, exchanging a glance with Henry. "That's one way to put it," she said. "But wealth isn't what defines us." Isabella finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you telling us this?" Henry's smile softened. "Because last night, we met a boy who reminded us of the values we built our success on: kindness, integrity, and courage." He looked at Jason with something almost like admiration. "And we don't believe in ignoring people who show us what truly matters." Jason could barely process what he was hearing. He had spent his whole life seeing wealthy people from a distance, assuming they lived in a world completely separate from his. And now, two of them were standing in his kitchen, telling him they had noticed him. But why? And what did it mean? Jason shifted uncomfortably as Evelyn and Henry exchanged another knowing glance. There was something in their eyes, something more than just gratitude. "We didn't just come to return your kindness," Evelyn said gently. "We wanted to understand why you did what you did." Jason's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Henry exhaled, his voice calm but firm. "After we left the diner last night, we couldn't stop thinking about you. A boy, barely 14, giving away the only money he had to help two strangers." He shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "That kind of selflessness isn't something you see every day." Jason glanced at his mother, who looked just as uncertain as he felt. "So," Evelyn continued, "we made a few calls." Jason's stomach twisted. "To who?" Henry smiled. "Your friend Lucas." Jason's heart skipped a beat. Evelyn's voice softened. "He told us about you, Jason. About how you've been taking odd jobs after school, mowing lawns, shoveling snow, just to help your mom. About how you go without lunch sometimes so she can have a little extra. About how you never ask for anything, even when you need it." Jason swallowed hard, looking down. Henry nodded. "You didn't just help us last night. You've been making sacrifices for a long time." He paused, then added, "And we think it's time someone helps you." Jason's throat tightened. He had spent so long just managing, just pushing forward. He never thought anyone would actually see him. But somehow, they had. Jason sat frozen, his mind struggling to process Evelyn and Henry's words. His mother, too, was still, her hands gripping her coffee mug so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Evelyn smiled gently. "We know life hasn't been easy for you too. And we also know you haven't asked for anything, not last night, not ever. But sometimes, Jason, the people who deserve help the most are the ones who never ask." Jason swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. He had never expected anything in return for helping them. That wasn't why he had done it. Henry leaned forward, his expression warm yet serious. "We want to offer you something, not as charity, but as an opportunity. A real chance to start fresh." Jason's mother finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. What do you mean?" Henry glanced at Evelyn, then back at Isabella. "A stable home. A place where you don't have to worry about late rent notices or a leaky roof. A chance for Jason to go to a good school, to have the opportunities he deserves." He turned to Jason. "And for you, young man, the freedom to just be a kid for once." Evelyn nodded. "And for you, Isabella, a job, one that pays what you're worth. No more struggling to make ends meet, no more sleepless nights wondering how you'll keep the lights on." Silence hung in the air. Jason felt his chest tighten. It sounded impossible, too good to be real. But as he looked at Evelyn and Henry, at the kindness in their eyes, he realized they weren't offering a dream. They were offering hope. Jason's mother, Isabella, let out a shaky breath. Her fingers tightened around her coffee mug as she tried to make sense of what she had just heard. Jason, sitting beside her, felt just as stunned. He had spent his entire life watching people with money move through the world as if they were untouchable, separate. And now, two of them were standing in their tiny kitchen, offering to change everything. It didn't make sense. His mother shook her head slightly. I don't understand," she said, her voice cautious. "Why would you do this for us?" Evelyn smiled warmly. "Because we can. And because we should." Henry nodded. Jason didn't hesitate to do the right thing last night, even though it cost him everything. People like that are rare, and when we meet them, we don't turn away. Jason felt his throat tighten. He wanted to believe them. He wanted to believe that kindness like this existed without strings attached. But he had spent too many years watching his mother struggle, watching life take more than it gave. People don't just help like this, he said quietly. Not without expecting something in return. Henry exhaled, understanding in his eyes. You're right. Most people don't. He leaned forward. But we're not most people. Jason glanced at his mother. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, the same hesitation that was clawing at his own heart. Too many broken promises. Too many letdowns. This kind of kindness, it felt impossible. But what if, just this once, it wasn't? Isabella sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the worn kitchen table, tracing the faint cracks in the wood with her fingertips. Her mind raced. For years, she had learned to survive on just enough food to get by, enough work to keep the lights on, enough hope to push through the next month. But this was more than she had ever let herself imagine. Jason watched her carefully. He knew that look. The same look she had when she sat at the kitchen table late at night, staring at overdue bills. The same look she had when she tried to hide how exhausted she was after another long shift. It's too much, she murmured, mostly to herself. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice gentle. Isabella, when was the last time you didn't have to fight for everything? Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She had spent so long being strong, so long accepting that life would always be hard. The thought of anything different, it scared her. Jason shifted beside her. Mom, his voice was soft, hesitant. She turned to him, searching his face. He had carried so much on his young shoulders. More than he ever should have. And now, for the first time, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. Henry spoke then, his voice steady. This isn't charity. This is a chance, one that you and Jason deserve. Isabella inhaled deeply, her hands still gripping the table. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop surviving. Maybe it was time to live. Jason sat still, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His heart pounded as he glanced between Evelyn and Henry, then at his mother. He could see the weight of the moment in her eyes, the hesitation, the fear, but also the smallest flicker of something he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. And yet, doubt gnawed at him. His whole life, he had been taught that nothing came easy. That struggle was just a part of living. He had seen his mother work herself to exhaustion, stretching every dollar, making sacrifices so he wouldn't have to. He had learned that people with money moved through the world differently. They didn't notice people like him. But Evelyn and Henry had. Jason's fingers tightened into fists. It was too much. Too good. And good things never lasted. What if, he hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. What if we say yes, and then it all disappears? Henry leaned forward, meeting his gaze. Then we'll still be here, he said simply. Because this isn't about money, Jason. It's about you. Evelyn nodded. You didn't hesitate to help us, even when it cost you everything. Let someone do the same for you. Jason's throat tightened. He wanted to believe them. His mother reached over, resting her hand on his. Baby, she whispered, maybe it's okay to trust this time. He looked at her. And then, finally, he let go of the fear. Jason exhaled shakily, looking at Evelyn and Henry. His voice was quiet, but firm. Okay. And just like that, his world changed. Jason felt the weight of his words settle in the air. Okay. It was just one word, but it carried more meaning than anything he had ever said before. Across the table, Evelyn and Henry exchanged a knowing glance, one of quiet relief, of understanding. They had seen hesitation in his eyes, the fear of hoping too much. And now, that fear was starting to fade. His mother exhaled softly, as if she had been holding her breath. Jason turned to look at her. For so long, she had been the one who bore the weight of their struggles, who worked herself to exhaustion to keep their world from crumbling. Now, for the first time, he saw something else in her face. Not just relief. Not just exhaustion. Possibility. Henry leaned forward, his voice warm. You won't regret this. Jason swallowed hard. What happens now? Evelyn smiled, reaching across the table to rest a gentle hand over Isabella's. Now, she said softly, we make sure you never have to struggle alone again. It didn't feel real, not yet. But as Jason sat there, watching his mother's shoulders finally relax, feeling the quiet certainty in Henry and Evelyn's presence, he realized something. For the first time in his life, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something to look forward to. A new beginning. Life has a way of testing us, often in moments when we least expect it. For Jason, stepping in to help two strangers at a diner was not a calculated decision, it was instinct. He didn't have much, but he gave what he had, not because he expected something in return, but because it was the right thing to do. How often do we see someone in need and hesitate? Maybe we tell ourselves that someone else will step in, or that it's not our responsibility. But Jason's story reminds us that kindness, true, selfless kindness, has the power to ripple outward in ways we could never predict. For those of us who have lived long enough to see both hardship and grace, this story holds a deeper truth. Sometimes, help comes from the most unexpected places. And just as important, sometimes we must allow ourselves to receive help. Jason and his mother had spent years surviving, believing that struggle was simply a part of life. But struggle doesn't have to define us. When genuine kindness is offered, accepting it isn't weakness, it's courage. As we move through life, may we choose to be more like Jason, willing to act when no one else will. And may we also be like Evelyn and Henry, recognizing goodness in others and using what we have to make a difference. Because at the end of the day, the greatest wealth isn't in what we keep, but in what we give.